Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, there was a question just casually floating around Twitter recently amongst the various different communities that I operate in. I think this one was actually in the Transformers comic book kind of superhero community. You know, people who like franchises from the 1980s and 1990s. Someone asked, when you were a kid, which did you identify with more? Was it the Autobots or the Decepticons from Transformers? And I find that kind of thing really fascinating. And I find that kind of thing really fascinating on a number of levels. Now, for me personally, to absolutely no one's surprise whatsoever, it was obviously the Decepticons. And not only was it obviously the Decepticons, but the identification was so strong that it came to the point that I just wasn't interested in the Autobots at all. So I remember situations where, like, for Christmases and birthdays, my parents were saying, "Oh, are you sure you want that and not this?" Because the one toy, the Autobot toy, was bigger. It had more stuff, but I wanted the little Decepticons set because I cared about the Decepticons and didn't care about the Autobots whatsoever. That has changed, that has shifted as the franchise itself has evolved. There are now the Autobots are now much more intriguing as more ambiguity has been introduced into the franchise through its various different incarnations. So you look at, like, for example, the IDW universes, and the Autobots are automatically more interesting because they're more ambiguous. It is not entirely the case anymore that you have this clear distinction between the good guys and the bad guys. There's a lot of ambiguity amongst the Autobots, to the point whereby some of the Autobots are a lot worse than many of the Decepticons. And I mean a lot worse. I'm looking at you, Prowl. Yeah, Prowl is a complete prick in the IDW universe, as is... what's his name? The Star Saber, is it? The guy from the Japanese continuities. His manifestation, his incarnation in the IDW universe, at least the previous one, not the one that's running now, is fascinating because he's a religious fanatic. He's a zealot and a crusader and a monster, an absolute monster. I'm looking at Tyrist and Flame and all of these guys that have real issues. I mean, even some of the more front and center characters have these problems. Whirl is a complete monster. Fortress Maximus in the More Than Meets the Eye comics goes off on one. He has, like, PTSD from being basically ripped apart and tortured for a very, very long time by Overlord. And yeah, he has issues too. Almost all of them do. Almost all of the characters have these wonderful depths and ambiguities that makes them way more interesting than they ever were in their original incarnations. But, you know, when I was a kid, it was the Decepticons always. And that was for a lot of reasons. I mean, I've thought long and hard about why that would be. I mean, part of it was just aesthetic. I like the look of the Decepticons more. They always had the more interesting colours and designs to me. Give me black and purple any day of the week over red, white and blue. Definitely give me black and purple over those colours. Definitely. I mean, that ties in, I suppose, in many respects to my complete and utter contempt for nationalism in all of its expressions. I mean, there's a reason why Optimus Prime is red, white and blue, you know, and why the Autobots and actually a lot of the good guy characters from franchises of that era tend to favour those colours. It's because there is a very subtle coding going on there, in the same way that there's a coding in the other direction as well. So a lot of the villains from 1980s, not only like toy franchises, children's cartoons, but also from cinema, from literature, from comic books, are queer coded. They're massively queer coded. They're not intentionally so. It is not the fact that the writers and the comic book artists are sitting down and, like, consciously trying to push this very particular agenda where they are portraying the bad guys as nominally queer. That's not the case. It's more of a cultural thing. It's unconscious. There is such a freight of queer-coded villains in culture at that point. That was just how it's done. So it's no mistake, therefore, that people like me, people who identify as queer, as gay, as trans, or whatever, identify more strongly with the villains. There's no mistake there whatsoever. It is certainly no mistake that now, as adults, we've come to identify so closely with the villains that there have been massive attempts within the present day incarnations of these franchises to muddy the waters, to make the villains more interesting by giving them more motivation than just being mustachio twirling monsters, you know? That has certainly happened with the Transformers. So you've had the shift of Megatron, for example, from simply being a despot and a tyrant to actually being a kind of freedom fighter. Certainly in the IDW universe. I mean, it ties in very closely with British history. I mean, Megatron is a miner. There is this real resonance with what happened in the 1980s with regards to the British mining population and their disputes with the Tories, with the establishment. That has been bred into the IDW lore, and not just IDW, but that has now become a much wider part of the universe. It's often the case that Megatron, the sort of Generation 1 Megatron, you know, was a miner or sort of like part of a subservient class that was abused, and that's where the Decepticon movement comes from. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself, and it's no wonder, once again, that people like me would identify with them. But it's a wider thing. If you look at any franchise from the 1980s, 1990s, the villains are often very, very queer-coded indeed, even when they are nominally straight, you know, even when they are like going after the sort of princess character or whatever, you know, there is still this incredible queer coding underneath. A really good example would be the Sheriff of Nottingham from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which is a 1992 film. Because of the way Alan Rickman plays him, because he is so over the top and theatrical, there is this incredible queerness to him, even though he nominally kind of lusts after Marion, sort of. There's a kind of almost pragmatic reason for his attentions towards Marion, in a very, very strange way. But that's what you get very, very often. And it's something that is embedded within culture. It's, as I said, it's not a conscious thing. It's not that writers of the era sat down and deliberately queer-coded their villains. That's just how you did villains. Like from the campy characters from the 1960s Batman, almost all of whom are queer-coded to some degree, right up to the more postmodern incarnations of those characters, most of whom are queer-coded to one degree or another. It's fascinating. It still happens, of course. It is still often the case that villains or antagonistic characters have this degree of queer coding in them. It's just that now there is a tendency to flourish that, or to almost undercut it with degrees of ambiguity, which I really rather like. That can only be a good thing. Also, there is now the tendency to make the antagonists more interesting as characters. It is not the case that they are simply villains and bastards and monsters and sadists and whatnot. There is, certainly within children's franchises and cartoons and whatnot, it's fascinating to see. It is really fascinating to see. It's certainly happening in things like the Marvel comics, for example, and in the DC comics. There is this desire to introduce complexity and ambiguity into storylines that traditionally were much more straightforward. So you had your heroes and you had your villains, and that was the end of it. It's certainly happened with postmodern incarnations of 1980s and 1990s sort of comic book or toy franchises. It's, and I mean, another really good example I can think of from my sort of late childhood, sort of early teenage years, would be Skeleton Warriors. Skeleton Warriors was an attempt to recreate the kind of franchise phenomenon that you had in the late 1980s. So things like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. There's another very good example, by the way, of queer-coded villains. things like Transformers and whatnot, it failed ultimately in that regard because the culture had changed at the time Skeleton Warriors came out. The culture had just shifted massively, and what was dominating sort of boys' toys supermarket shelves was video game consoles and things like that. The whole culture had shifted. So trying to synthetically create that bubble, those phenomena that became schoolyard obsessions, it just didn't work, unfortunately. And this is not a slight on the quality of the toy franchise itself. It's actually very, very good. The figures are beautiful. They're absolutely stunning figures. The skeletons are designed to look and feel like real bone, like they're sculpted out of real bone, and they're beautiful quality. The sculpting is incredible on those things. But the cartoon that came out to synchronize with the toy line, it's very good. It's very, very good, actually. I mean, it does have this. It is very much a product of its intention, so it still has those problems whereby there are the good guys and there are the bad guys, and the good guys are this and the bad guys are that, and there's no real deeper motivation in the big bad guy other than the fact that he is a monster. Baron Dark, well, his name kind of tells you it all, really, doesn't he? He's just a monster. But the way they decided to characterize him in the cartoon is very much like the Beast Wars incarnation of Megatron. He is this sardonic, very camp, queer-coded, mustachio-twirling villain, to the point whereby he even seems to flirt with some of the male hero characters, most notably Joshua Greyskull, who is kind of like an attempt to introduce some ambiguity into it. He's kind of like the good guy who is slightly more negative, but is ultimately just as heroic as all the others, There's none of that in the skeleton camp, by the way. They're all just bastards. They're all just monsters. But there are some wonderful villains in it. There are some actually really fun, very pure villains in it. And Baron Dark being like the apex of them. He is just your vaudeville villain. He would be like running around tying maidens to train tracks in another era. Bringing him up, Beast Wars Megatron. Totally different character from the original Megatron. In fact, a kind of, not a direct descendant, but someone who took the name and the inspiration of the original Megatron to start his own civil war. He is another really good example. He is like the most queer-coded villain imaginable. He has all of the traits of the queer-coded villains of certain eras of cinema. He is vaudeville, he's mustachio-twirling. He's a monster, but he's also theatrical, overblown, and has this incredible sense of irony about him. He knows his own situation and is so completely aware of it that he treats it with a certain degree of kitsch. And that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of fun to watch on screen. He even when he's in defeat, you get the impression that it doesn't faze him a great deal. He just gets on with it. There's always some contingency. He's much smarter than everyone else on the board. And as a result, he almost wins. He almost gets there, Of course, that changes quite dramatically when you come to Beast Machines. Like a lot of the characters, he changes quite dramatically, for the better, insofar as I'm concerned, because Beast Machines really does mark the beginning of this phenomena I'm talking about. First of all, they remove a lot of the queer coding from him, so suddenly he is not this incredibly theatrical, slightly camp and kitsch character. He becomes a kind of ideologue. He becomes a zealot and a demagogue. He has a very certain philosophy and an ideology that is driving his antagonism now, beyond tyranny, beyond just, I want to control everything. He actually does have a degree of idealism in Beast Machines, and in many respects it marks the beginning of what we're talking about here, the introduction of ideological ambiguity. So there are moments in Beast Machines where Megatron talks with Optimus Primal, the nominal protagonist, and they discuss their ideologies, their conflicting and divergent ideologies which are driving this conflict. Beast Machines also does this very wonderful thing of doing the opposite as well. So it takes the characters who are just quite frankly, boringly heroic and one-dimensional, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I never liked the good guys from the 1980s franchises, because that's all they are. They're blank slates. There's nothing ambiguous or interesting about hardly any of them. There is no character to them, whereas all of the likes of the Decepticons, the Darkling Lords, the Cobra characters, the Inhumanoids, all of these guys had ambiguities to their character. They had flaws because they were villains, so they were just automatically more interesting anyway. And that kind of extremity is interesting as well anyway, you know? But, yeah, getting back to Beast Machines, the primal character, who was quite unambiguous in Beast Wars, he was the hero, although he was more interesting than his predecessor, Optimus Prime. In Beast Machines, the writer Robert Skur introduced this wonderful ambiguity where he becomes a zealot too. Very like Megatron, he becomes as extreme in his own way as Megatron is, and that is something that the show actually tackles and deals with as a matter of his character development, and that's wonderful. That had never happened in Transformers before, and didn't happen in many cartoons or children's franchises of the era. It was kind of a new thing. It was kind of a stepping stone in many respects, and that has led to lots of similar concepts being slowly drip-fed into not only Transformers but other franchises down the line, to the point whereby now it's de rigueur, it's actually standard for children's franchises to have this degree of complexity in their writing. So you don't necessarily just have the villains and the good guys. You have characters who are operating in certain situations, who are trying to work themselves out, you know? Great examples are things like Gravity Falls, like Adventure Time. Adventure Time is probably one of the best examples I can think of. Adventure Time has hardly any non-ambiguous characters. There's hardly anyone who is a complete villain or a complete hero. Everyone has their flaws. I mean, a very good example would be Princess Bubblegum. Princess Bubblegum, who initially is kind of almost the archetypal princess character, almost like Princess Peach from Mario, but actually turns out to be this incredibly complex, manipulative, totalitarian ruler who keeps an almost Orwellian eye on her subjects. Not only that, but also turns out to be queer as well, to be in a same-sex relationship with another one of the really ambiguous characters, Marceline the Vampire Queen. If you want to see like almost the apex, the ultimate expression of how children's franchises have evolved in terms of the complexity of their writing from my childhood, the 1980s, where quite frankly there was hardly anything that did us any credit. You can count on the fingers of one hand the cartoons, the toy franchises, the comics that actually did us as thinking and imaginative entities some degree of respect, because most of them, let's face it, were products of Thatcherism and Reaganism. They were designed to sell as plastic, and also they carried freights of ideological conditioning. So there are good guys and there are bad guys, and the good guys they are the patriots, they are the people who are not queer, they are the people who are down the line, they are the people who are certain and absolute, very masculine, very feminine, who represent absolute ideals, and traditionally prescribed ones at that. That is completely dissolved as the children of that era have grown up and become writers and creators themselves, and have seen the bullshit that we were fed and want to correct it for generations that come after. That has led into the likes of Adventure Time, where everything is ambiguous, everything is complex, from the most mundane characters, which often turn out to be really significant, to the most comedic or the most significant. I mean, the best example is the Ice King, obviously. The Ice King is wonderful. Simon Petrikov. In the first episodes of Adventure Time, for the longest time, he's just the doofy villain. He is an archetype. He is just the doofy comic foil villain, and that is it. That's all he is. Then you get that episode, the Christmas episode, where he finds these old VHS tapes and the other characters start watching them. and you get his background, you get where he comes from, and his background is tied into the back mythology of the entire show. And it turns out he's actually the most tragic, the most self-sacrificing, the most heroic character in the entire show. It flips itself on its head, and Adventure Time does that beautifully all the time. The characters are always conflicted. They're always involved in these strange internal and external conflicts where they don't know who they are, they don't know how they relate to other characters or what they want, or they're trying to force situations to be ways that they can't be, and they have to learn. You know, that is a beautiful thing. The cartoons I grew up with hardly ever did that. In fact, they never did, really. Almost everything they introduced, with a one or two exceptions. I mean, I would certainly throw up some of the 1990s Nicktoons as exceptions. Things like the original series of the Rugrats, things like Rocko's Modern Life, Real Monsters, that kind of thing. Those shows did start to explore the ambiguities of existence, where you didn't necessarily have just good guys and bad guys. You had people in states of conflict and confusion, trying to work out their experiences, and that's very beautiful. I really appreciate that. Even shows I didn't like as a kid, actually watching them now, are quite sophisticated. So things like Hey Arnold. Hey Arnold was one of the latter day Nicktoons from when I was kind of like early high school years, so maybe just moving out of watching that kind of thing. And I didn't like Hey Arnold. I found it quite boring, actually. I found it quite dull in comparison to the likes of Real Monsters, Rocko's Modern Life, which were a bit more interesting to me. But going back and watching it, actually, that is an incredibly sophisticated show that has a lot going on underneath. There's a lot of commentary on class conflicts. Everyone is working class. Almost everyone is working class in it, and there are conflicts that derive from that. There are generational gaps in it. So the title character, Arnold, his mother and father aren't present, and I can't remember whether you ever find out why, but he lives with his grandfather and his grandmother in a boarding house. And that's interesting. There's actually this one character, Helga Pataki, who is an abused child. She's an abused child. Her mother is a drunk. Her father is a bullish, hyper-masculine, hyper-conservative prick. And she is neglected. She is totally and utterly neglected, if not outright abused. And the show deals with that. There are actually episodes that deal with that internal conflict, and that's beautiful. I'm glad that show existed when I wasn't really, I was sort of like on my way out of being a kid at that point, but going back and looking at it, it's wonderful that phenomena had started. But yeah, it is now well worth going and checking out children's franchises because there's a lot of sophisticated work happening in them, and that has continued to this present day. I mean, even Adventure Time now is quite old, you know, as cartoon franchises go. I tend to oh god, I was someone on Twitter the other day talking about how they grew up with Adventure Time, and I'm sort of like, oh my god, 37 over here, you know. It's sort of like, oh Jesus Christ. But yeah, it's fascinating to delve into. I am always fascinated as to what drives us to be interested in what we're interested in, and why we identified with certain things as children, and why we then identify with certain things as adults. It's fascinating to me. Anecdotally, this is not a study, obviously, but anecdotally, most of my friends are queer to some degree, or they are neuroatypical, or they are deviant. They are outside of the fishbowl looking in, because of course they are. You know, how could they possibly be anything else? They probably wouldn't associate with me otherwise. And almost all of them are the same. They all of us identified with the villains in our franchises, in our cartoons, in our comics, in our media. We loved Skeletor and Tex Hex and Stampede and Megatron and the Darkling Lords and all of these guys, and don't really have much connection to the heroes. And I find that interesting on a number of levels. Of course, it stands to reason that those of us who identified as LGBTQ, or as in any way as being outside of the fishbowl looking in, whereby circumstances forced us outside of cultural meta-narrative, if you like, part of the reason why we would have identified with villains or with the monsters or the negative characters in our media when we were children is because very often there was a conformist nature to that media. The monsters, the villains, the bad guys were often those characters that had themselves been forced out of the prescribed narratives for whatever reason, you know? So it really does stand to reason in that regard. Also, you have the fact that much of the time the heroic characters were not only completely frictionless, they were just vehicles for very particular ideologies and agendas. They were also the manifestations of those meta-narratives. You know, they were the paternalistic, the hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine archetypes, and were prescribers of order and of a status quo that advertised itself as being absolutely normal and desirable, which of course, for those of us who are outside the fishbowl looking in, it is not. It often is not desirable or normal. That, of course, has changed. Over the decades, certainly since the 1980s, that has changed dramatically. To the point whereby now there is so much in the way of ambiguity that the characters who are not heroes as such, but are the protagonists of children's cartoons, of video games, or of whatever, are much more identifiable. So you've got characters like, for example, Finn from Adventure Time, Finn and Jake, who are ambiguous characters who are often dealing with their own problems and issues and are not perfect. They are powerfully not perfect. You've got the cast of the regular show, who are just normal guys, who are neither good nor bad. They're not one archetype or another. They are just normal people with their own very peculiar neuroses and problems and issues, and in a very postmodern vein as well. I mean, the regular show is a very good example because the characters in the regular show are dealing with everything from existing in like a job situation where they are deprived and they don't really enjoy what they're doing and they don't really have a place in society as such. They're kind of deviants and they're kind of slackers and they're kind of neither one thing nor the other. They are also powerfully normal. You know, they're dealing with sort of metaphysical angst in a way that a lot of us do. a lot of us who were born sort of since the 1970s, sort of the latter Generation X, the early millennials, Generation Z, all of us who have come after, I suppose. It's the kind of thing that we deal with quite a lot as part and parcel of our existence. You know, the meta-narratives often don't apply to us, no matter how enshrined they are, no matter how much popular culture and media tries to insist upon them and impose them. They often don't apply for lots of different reasons, and the pathways by which people would normally have accessed those narratives, like through university, for example, getting a degree or whatever, just isn't open anymore. They've been undermined by powerfully insidious forces of capitalism, of conservatism, and lots of other things as well, to be perfectly honest. There is a grand state of ennui and decay in our societal systems that is reflected in our media, and that is it's simultaneously bad and good. You know, there are negative aspects, obvious negative aspects, and there are positive aspects as well. I mean, Adventure Time in many respects reflects both very beautifully, as do the likes of Steven Universe, to a lesser extent the regular show. The regular show is a little bit darker in the sense that it does incorporate the joy of life, but it also has a lot of darkness in it, a lot of which is it's understated. It's kind of unspoken. It's not directly commented upon, which is actually very clever, considering that it's a cartoon that's sort of not really aimed at children. Children could get a lot out of it, but it's not really aimed at children. What it deals with is perhaps somewhat too advanced and perhaps somewhat too dark in that regard. I mean, one of the things I really like about the regular show is the fact that there often isn't a happy ending to the whatever tensions are brought up. I mean, you see that with Mordecai and his various problems with relationships and women. There is not a standard or prescribed resolution to that. It's actually complex and dark, and people get hurt, and it's just the way it is, you know. It's a very powerful thing for what is ultimately a cartoon to do. But yeah, it's fascinating to me. It is endlessly fascinating. It's something you see reflected in children's literature as well, very, very often. I mean, there are moments where there are stumbling blocks. There are things like Harry Potter, for example, which occurred after his Dark Materials, and kind of knocked his Dark Materials off the top slot as one of the most read children's series in existence. And that's a real shame, because Harry Potter, in many respects, despite its superficial and very liberal attempts to appear as though it's progressive and as though it can talk about issues, it's actually not. It's powerfully conservative and often very problematic in many, 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 many respects, in terms of its portrayals of relationships and its portrayals of ethnic minorities and lots of other things as well. So there are stumbling blocks that occur. There are sort of these moments where the culture of these things lurches powerfully to the right and to the past and to tradition, and that's a problem, that's an issue. But generally the trend certainly in children's media, more powerfully in children's media than arguably anywhere else, it has been powerfully towards this almost utopian feeling of progressivism, and I kind of love that. I really, really do love that. The fact that it's happening subversively, that it's happening under the radar. And no, you know, there are some upsets every now and then. You get someone complaining because there's a gay character or a trans character in a Marvel comic or whatever, or in a video game or whatever. But the general trend is towards inclusivity and representation, and also of commenting upon the concerns of these demographics and of these situations and making them into stories, you know, which is wonderful. That's absolutely brilliant. That can only be a positive thing. It can only be a positive thing. So yeah, it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating to me, that one.